I guess it's time for another dangerous dinosaur. A lot's happened in the last couple of weeks that I want to comment on. Two very tragic incidences in Colorado. One where a negligent policeman stuck a suspect in his patrol car that he parked on railroad tracks, causing the subject to get creamed by the train. He shouldn't have parked there in the first place. I suppose he's going to say his training was his excuse. A second one, even more tragic, is a young fellow called 911 for help. He was afraid to get out of his car. He was in the mountains. It was dark. Several policemen from several jurisdictions showed up to help the individual after the 911 call. And it ended up that the police officers showing up to help him murdered him. I would say shot him, but to me it's almost a matter of murder. And there's some explanation for it, and I think we ought to discuss this and maybe deconstruct a lot of what's happened. I think what we've got to look at is changes since the Nixon administration. Changes in our legal system, changes in our law system. When I first started practicing law, I was under a common law system. Now I'm not so sure. I'm fairly certain we're practicing under a Napoleonic system, and the most aggravated, severe part of the Napoleonic system is martial law, which we're operating under now. We have a lot of instances where police have been killing citizens, and it has been excused by the old Hitlerian excuse, I'm just following orders. Only the modernized version is I'm following my training, I'm following my practice, etc. And nobody's questioning who's training these sons of bitches. How could you be trained to kill somebody that you're there to help? What kind of training do you get? And I got to think it's symbolic. You're trained to control things. You're trained to not be a helpmate or help citizenry. You're trained to control them. You're trained that the citizens are the enemy, and consequently have all kinds of different behavior patterns, one of which is killing the citizenry. So when the police arrived in the mountains in Idaho Springs to help this poor kid who was afraid to get out of his car, and he didn't roll down his window, he didn't do this, he didn't do that, that the officers kept saying, we can't help you unless you obey us, you have to obey us. All of a sudden his disobedience became symbolic and a threat to their authority, which to them is more important than their mission to help people. And because the authority was denied, essentially, they killed him. And that way they got him to recognize his authority. To me, it's bewildering how anybody can justify helping a person by murdering them, but that's a whole different philosophical view. But you have another instance where they put the passenger or an arrestee in a patrol car parked on a railroad track, and of course a train came by and damn near killed the arrestee. And it's mind-boggling how this happens, but you could look back at the history since Nixon. And what happened is we had a law and order platform. Law and order meant that back at that time keep the minorities in their place, but it expanded. And at that time, I was one of the counsel for the Italian American Civil Rights League, which, bluntly speaking, I defended mafioso, what they called mafioso, or LCN people, Italian Americans, but back then there was labeling, and most Italian Americans were considered hooked in somehow to organized crime, and that was propaganda bullshit that the Nixon administration was peddling. But they had to peddle fear like Procter & Gamble peddled soap. So let me tell you how it was in the 60s. I was representing fairly well-known people from all over the country. with Italian names, and the sheriffs, marshals, etc. weren't fooled. They would call my office and say, "Dennis, are you representing so-and-so?" And I'd say, "Yes." "Well, we have a warrant for his arrest. What's the bond?" They tell me the bond. "Can you bring him in?" And I'd bring the big bad mafioso into the marshal's office or into the sheriff's office. He'd post the bond, turn around, and walk out. Now, the press didn't like this. They called it the turnkey thing. But that's the purpose of bond, was to ensure their presence. And if a lawyer's going to surrender a client, you can pretty much give odds on the fact that the client's going to be there for court. In fact, very few of them ever didn't show up for court, even with high bonds. They weren't really flight risk. This was part of their occupation, and this was part of their status, etc. Well, in order to sell things, sell products, sell war machinery to the police, we had to invent more danger. So instead of sitting around in donut shops, they sat around thinking of how they were in danger. And all of a sudden, we had a war on drug, we had hippies, we had people that wouldn't conform to authority, that wouldn't go to their draft board or go to selective service or go into the Army, go in the Air Force. They were viewed as commies, commie-inspired revolutionaries, etc. Not only that, they let their hair grow, which offended middle-class America. These people got classified as dangerous. During that time, I was a municipal judge, and some of the people in my village wanted to get sheep shears and sheep shear the hippies and cut their hair and all this kind of stuff. It was interesting, traumatic times, but there wasn't really any real danger. These people weren't dangerous. They didn't attack police. Once in a while, maybe some would, a real radical, but rarely. But the press went after things, and the propaganda arm of the Republican Party and the Nixonites went after the idea of a turnstile justice. They got the idea of preventive detention. The purpose of police wasn't law enforcement. The purpose was to protect the citizenry. And that went against probably 10 centuries of common law jurisprudence. But it was a good marketing point. It got votes, etc. Well, when you start selling protection, you're the same as the mafia, and all of a sudden the government's running a protection racket. And to run the protection racket, you need to have various benefits of the racket. Part of the racket is selling equipment, particularly military equipment, to the police. So instead of calling lawyers to surrender their clients, they invent a SWAT squad, special weapons and tactics, and they arm the police as though they were going into combat against their own citizens. And they market the fact that citizenry is dangerous. They dichotomize the police and citizenry, and all of a sudden you've got a them and us situation where law enforcement becomes symbolic, and it's the authority that counts, the authority of the police to make arrests, the authority to do this and the authority to do that. In the meantime, we're privatizing the hell out of everything, and all the arms makers are getting together at various conventions like in Las Vegas and selling advanced weaponry to the police forces. The arms industry is in on it. The Pentagon gets in on it. They get a market for their surplus weaponry. That you get, instead of police carrying sidearms, they're carrying assault weapons, and they're showing how dangerous everything is and how tough their job is. And frankly, growing up in the country, driving tractors and things like that, I figured that a lot more dangerous than being a policeman. In fact, my brother was an Air Force pilot. He flew rescue helicopters, and he rescued downed pilots. And most rescue missions, he was under fire. A much more dangerous job than being a policeman running after hippies. And I started my practice in the hippie land of Boulder, Colorado, and there was a lot of hippies there, a lot of marijuana smokers, a lot of anti-war protesters. And pretty soon the cops started shooting at them. Well, you start shooting at college students, you really got to be careful what you're doing. And particularly in Boulder, because there was a lot of rich people in Boulder that were more likely sue the state and local governments than not. And you never knew who you arrested. In my own practice, I had several U.S. senators, relatives, kids, nephews, etc. I had a couple admirals' kids. I had some generals' kids. And ironically, one of the general's kids was the head of the Army National Guard at Kent State. It was interesting times. But what's happening is you arm your police force, and then you teach them that the first thing they have to do is control. And then they become armed guards rather than investigators and policemen. So you sell them on the idea they're guarding the public, they're making the public safe, etc., etc., etc. And they're doing it the easy way instead of using science and criminology and sociology and things like this. So you don't really make them safe, you make them feel safe. You can make them safe by making the community safer and more cohesive. But if you don't want to spend the money doing that, then what you do is you arm your police force and do it by force of violence or by fear and intimidation. So you can, if you're the mafia, you can sell protection, and you get a compliance and you get them to pay by throwing bricks through windows, as opposed to an insurance company that sells a premium. And this is what we've essentially degenerated to. The court system has become a shell for private enterprise. And the trends aren't good. We're going to have to really look at that, because now we're using artificial intelligence for sentencing decisions and things like this. We're manufacturing victims in order to prove a point that we need to regulate this, that, or the other. For instance, I had a client recently, a friend of mine actually, handled his divorce 50 years ago, who was recently sent to the penitentiary for having nude young boys on his machine. He didn't promulgate them. He didn't do this. He didn't do that. They stayed on his computer, and they prosecuted him for having child porn. He's now in the penitentiary, and we're having a battle because he's 75 on Social Security, and even though none of his pictures got out into the public, they won't give him his medication, they won't give him shoes, things like this, because he's on Social Security and he can afford them, and the state shouldn't have to pay for them. Even though Social Security law says you can't attach the Social Security check, since he has access to the check and he's in the penitentiary, they're going to make him pay. I don't know who makes these rules up, who researches them, but I can tell you one thing: with computerization in the court system, there's no feedback loop whatsoever. And these jackass judges are just mind-bogglingly numb to common sense and reality. The law says this, you do that. And that comes from having a Napoleonic code rather than actual common law. But be that as it may, we have now all kinds of things going on. I remember I used to be able to ask a judge for a stay of execution for $30, $50, $100 in county court. Now they make them apply for credit to not pay a court fine. Well, my clients were stubborn sons of bitches, and they'd probably just soon wait till they got the $50 to pay it rather than apply and demean themselves in front of some bureaucrat about why they couldn't pay $50 that day. So they didn't stop by and apply for stays of execution. They didn't apply for credit. And then they got arrested and they had to make bond again. And it became a perpetual thing that could have been done if some jackass judge wouldn't have just wrote, pay $50 by January 1st or something like that, instead of going through this bureaucratic bullshit that they put people through that degrade them, humiliate them, and frustrate them. That's just one example. The other example is bond. John Mitchell, whose famous wife Marcia used to call the press and rat him off, made this comment when they were talking about preventive detention under Nixon, that the public would never go for preventive detention. Now we have a whole industry of pretrial services built by the government and manned by private enterprise. So what we've done, instead of building a system for the people to take care of crime and crime problems, we've built a system so that we can hire outside privatized corporations to screw the citizenry into compliance and to redistribute the wealth from the peasantry to the rich people that run corporations so they can impose various programs on us that aren't really needed. But it makes the judges feel good. It makes the citizenry feel good. It makes the bureaucrats feel good because they think they're doing something. None of them, absolutely none of them that I've talked to in 60 years of practice realize they're screwing the people. That's the unfortunate thing. They're all just numb to that fact. They think they're doing a great job. They think they're doing great by putting people on a treadmill, by rearresting them all the time for failure to appear because they can't afford bus fare, or failure to appear because they forget things, or failure to appear because they have no support system. They didn't grow up in country clubs like these judges did. They didn't grow up with rich parents like these judges did. They didn't have people changing their diapers, changing their shorts, washing and ironing their socks all the time, and making sure they got to soccer practice, or golf practice, or swim practice, or things like that. And then they wonder why people don't show up. And if they don't show up, well, obviously it's contempt of court. Not that they didn't know any better. So let's hire some private detective agency to follow them. Let's hire some private party to give them counseling. Let's make them pay so much a week to pee in a bottle so we can have a private company analyze their pee, and they can all make a bit of a profit. And the purpose then is to generate industry, to generate profit. The prison complex is becoming almost as bad as the defense contractors. And now they're working hand in glove. I defy any of your readers, any of my viewers, to give me a good reason why cops should be armed, why we should have SWAT squads, as opposed to more understanding policemen. Ask this question. If we abolish SWAT squads and started getting police with common sense, whose job was to help people rather than enforce law or look for bad in people, would we have officers leaving citizens in a train to be run over so they could search a car? Or would we have some paranoid person that's afraid of coming out of a car, murdered because he didn't obey a policeman's lawful order? Or was the order lawful? Or should he be murdered for being in a position where he was afraid and irrational and essentially legally insane or incapacitated? Is the purpose to protect life or to get compliance? Are our officers there to help people or make them obey? We should be looking at this. And if the training is to make them obey rather than to help people, let's fire all the goddamn trainers. These people are incompetent. They shouldn't be training police officers. They should be washing milk bottles or studying the Constitution or thinking about other people, doing community service themselves rather than impose it upon the peasantry or upon the working people of this country. It's time that we stop being exploited. It's time that we make the government answerable to us. It's time that we make the police answerable. The idea isn't to defund the police department or anything like that. It's to quit the idea of policing and let's have helpmates out there. Let's train people to be helpful. When I was in high school, the State Patrol carried gas tanks to help motorists that were stranded. They carried jumper cables. They would pull over and help stranded motorists, rather than want to search them for drugs or things such as this, or what's going on here, why are you off the side of the road? It's crazy. And it's crazy that all the people are letting him get away with this without question. And it's crazy the propaganda machine is saying that we don't support police. I support police. I believe in police. I'm a criminologist. I'm a lawyer. I believe in law. But I don't believe in fascism. I don't believe in police state tactics. I believe that we need to form a more perfect union, and we need to provide for the health, safety, and welfare of the general public and not for General Motors. You guys have a good day, and thank you very much.